She humiliated the black waitress in front of everyone, laughing as if she was untouchable. But just as she demanded to see the manager, the kitchen doors burst open, and the person who stepped out changed everything. What happened next left her shaking. The dim glow of golden chandeliers cast a soft light over the lavish restaurant, where the clinking of fine china and murmured conversations filled the air. Every detail of Le Bernard's, the city's most exclusive dining spot, screamed sophistication. From the crisp white linens to the soft classical music that hummed in the background. It was a place where the wealthy dined, where business moguls and socialites sipped on vintage wine as they discussed million-dollar deals. Among the poised and polished patrons, Lisa moved gracefully between tables, her posture straight, her hands steady. She had been working at Le Bernard's for only a few weeks, but she had already learned an important lesson. Some guests believed their money gave them the right to treat others as less than human. She had seen it before. The entitled sneers, the impatient tapping of manicured nails, the way they spoke down to those in uniform. But no one had ever tested her patience quite like the woman at table 7, Victoria Kensington. The name itself carried weight. She was old money, heiress to a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, draped in pearls and designer silk, exuding privilege from every pore. She sat at the center of her table, surrounded by equally well-dressed friends, a crystal flute of champagne delicately held between her fingers. From the moment Lisa had approached, she had felt the woman's cold, assessing gaze sweep over her, like a judge evaluating something beneath her. "Finally," Victoria drawled, not even bothering to look up. "I thought we'd have to call the health department to see if you got lost in the kitchen." A ripple of soft laughter spread across the table. Lisa felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "I apologize for the wait," Lisa said, keeping her voice calm. "What can I get for you this evening?" Victoria sighed dramatically and flipped open the menu, her red-tipped nails tapping against the surface. "I don't know. You tell me. What's actually edible here?" Another laugh from her friends. Lisa had handled worse. She simply nodded and began listing the evening's specials, her tone professional, her demeanor unwavering. But the more composed she remained, the more Victoria pushed. When Lisa turned to pour water into her glass, Victoria abruptly lifted her hand, deliberately knocking the pitcher. Water splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, a few drops landing on Victoria's expensive silk blouse. She gasped, recoiling as if she had been doused in acid. "Oh my God, are you serious?" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the restaurant's elegant hum like a blade. Heads turned, conversations hushed. Lisa instinctively reached for a napkin, her heart pounding. But before she could react, Victoria was already waving her away. "Don't touch me," she spat, eyes flashing. "This is a Valentino. Do you have any idea how much this costs?" Lisa's fingers curled slightly around the napkin, but she took a slow breath. She wouldn't give Victoria the reaction she wanted. Victoria turned to her friends with a smirk, shaking her head. "Honestly, I don't know why they let people like her work here. It ruins the atmosphere." A quiet hush fell over the restaurant. Even Victoria's friends seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Lisa felt the weight of the stares. She felt the silent judgment, the expectation that she would simply bow her head, apologize, and accept the humiliation. It had happened before, after all. People like Victoria always assumed they were untouchable. Victoria let out a scoff, tossing her napkin onto the table as if Lisa were no longer worth acknowledging. "Get me the manager," she said coolly. "Someone competent, before I make a call and get you out of here for good." Lisa held her breath. The other waiters nearby didn't move. The hostess at the front, who had witnessed the entire exchange, looked frozen in place. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the kitchen doors swung open. A hush fell over the room as a man in a crisp white chef's coat emerged, his sleeves rolled up, his dark eyes locked on Victoria. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The restaurant's owner had just stepped out of the kitchen, and Victoria was about to learn exactly who she had been insulting. For a moment, the only sound in the restaurant was the quiet hum of the chandeliers swaying ever so slightly overhead. The air itself seemed to tighten, drawing every gaze toward the man who had just emerged from the kitchen. Marcus Bennett, the owner of Le Bernard's. Victoria, still dabbing at the barely noticeable water stain on her designer blouse, barely spared him a glance. She waved a dismissive hand in his direction. Finally, "Are you the manager?" she asked, exasperated. "Because I need to speak with someone who actually knows how to run a restaurant." Lisa didn't move. She didn't need to. She saw the subtle flicker of recognition in the eyes of the other staff members, the way the waiters near the bar stood a little straighter, the slight widening of the hostess's eyes. They all knew what Victoria did not. Marcus stepped forward, slowly pulling off his apron and draping it neatly over one arm. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. His eyes swept over the table, taking in the scene. Lisa standing with her back straight, hands still gripping the napkin. Victoria lounging in her chair with a smug smirk, and the half-curious, half-uncomfortable faces of her wealthy friends, waiting to see what would happen next. "Good evening," Marcus said finally, his voice smooth, controlled. "I understand there's a problem?" Victoria let out a dramatic sigh, turning fully toward him now, as if finally acknowledging his presence. "Yes, there most certainly is," she said. "Your staff is completely incompetent. This girl," she gestured lazily at Lisa without even looking at her, "just spilled water all over me and barely even apologized." Marcus's eyes flicked to Lisa's, searching. He didn't need her to say a word. He had been watching from the back. He had seen everything. "I see," he said, voice neutral. Victoria mistook his calm demeanor for agreement. Emboldened, she continued, "Frankly, I don't know what kind of standards you have here, but places like this should uphold a certain level of—" She paused, tilting her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Wait a second." Finally, she truly looked at him. A shadow of uncertainty flickered across her face. Marcus met her gaze steadily, waiting. "You're—" Victoria trailed off, and then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're the owner?" The table behind her went dead silent. Her friends, who had been quietly watching the spectacle unfold, suddenly seemed to shrink in their seats, as if trying to distance themselves from her, without making it obvious. Marcus remained composed, his face unreadable. "That's correct." Victoria blinked, clearly struggling to process this new information. "Well," she scoffed, crossing her arms, "that doesn't change the fact that your employee was completely out of line. I come to establishments like this expecting a certain level of professionalism and—" Marcus held up a hand. Not forceful, not aggressive, just enough to make her stop talking. "I understand, Ms. Kensington," he said smoothly. "You expect a high standard of service. So do I." Victoria lifted her chin, clearly taking this as an indication that she was winning. "So you'll handle it?" she pressed. "Because if not, I have plenty of friends in this industry. A few calls, and I can make sure this place is never on the top dining lists again." Lisa remained silent, but she could feel the weight of Marcus's presence beside her. There was no anger in his face, no defensiveness, just absolute certainty. "You're right about one thing," Marcus said finally. This restaurant does uphold the highest standards. Victoria smirked. That's why I don't allow anyone to disrespect my staff. The smirk froze. I saw everything, Marcus continued, his voice never rising, but carrying through the room like a steel blade wrapped in velvet. I saw how you spoke to Lisa. I saw how you treated her like she was less than human. I saw how you expected everyone in this room to turn a blind eye because of who you are. Victoria's lips parted slightly, her carefully curated poise cracking at the edges. You see, Marcus said, taking a slow step forward. What you failed to realize is that Lisa is not just an employee. He turned then, looking at Lisa for the first time since he had entered the room. And when he spoke next, his voice was no longer just that of a restaurant owner. She's my daughter. The words landed like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Someone dropped a fork. Even the waitstaff, who had suspected something was coming, seemed momentarily stunned into silence. Lisa didn't move. She didn't need to. The weight of those words, of that truth, had already shifted the entire power dynamic in the room. Victoria's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. The weight of Marcus's words settled over the room like a heavy storm cloud. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, her carefully curated poise unraveling at the edges. For the first time that evening, she didn't have a snide remark or an entitled demand ready on her lips. Lisa felt the shift. The very air inside Le Bernard's had changed. The hushed conversations that once buzzed between tables had ceased entirely. The elegant hum of the restaurant, once filled with the sounds of expensive silverware clinking against fine china, had fallen still. All eyes were on her. Victoria's friends exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a blonde woman in an emerald gown, reached for her wine glass with slightly trembling fingers. The others suddenly found their menus far more interesting, avoiding Victoria's gaze as if distancing themselves from the scene unfolding before them. But Victoria wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. She let out a sharp, breathy laugh, though it sounded more forced than confident. "Your daughter?" she repeated, as if trying to convince herself she had misheard. "You're joking, right?" Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. His expression remained calm, unreadable. "I don't joke about family," he said. A flicker of panic crossed Victoria's face, but she quickly masked it with another scoff. "Well," she said, reaching for her purse, her fingers tightening around the expensive leather. "That explains a lot." Lisa's jaw tensed, but she remained still. Marcus, however, tilted his head slightly. "Explain what, exactly?" Victoria waved a hand dismissively, as if the answer was obvious. "Why she's still here," she said, her voice regaining some of its previous arrogance. "Nepotism. That's the only reason someone like her would last in a place like this." A murmur ran through the restaurant. Lisa saw one of the waiters near the bar shift uncomfortably, his grip tightening around a tray of drinks. A few patrons shook their heads, disapproving. Marcus's expression didn't change, but Lisa noticed the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides, controlled, measured restraint. "I hired Lisa because she is one of the most hard-working, dedicated people I have ever met," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "She didn't earn this job because she's my daughter. She earned it because she's better than most people who walk through these doors." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus wasn't finished. "And if you think that your money, your connections, or your last name gives you the right to treat my staff like they're beneath you," he continued, "then you are not the kind of customer we serve here." Victoria's face paled further. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." A few tables away, an older gentleman who had been silently watching the entire exchange set his glass down with a quiet clink. A woman in a navy blue dress leaned in to whisper something to her companion. Lisa could feel the energy in the room shift again, tilting in her favor. Victoria, however, wasn't done fighting. She turned in her seat, looking toward the other patrons for support. "Is this really how you treat paying customers?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "I spend more money in a week than most people make in a year, and you're telling me I don't belong here?" Marcus didn't flinch. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa watched as the words sank in. Victoria Kensington. Rejected. Publicly. It was a concept so foreign to her that she looked genuinely lost for a moment, her lips parting as if struggling to comprehend what was happening. Then, just as quickly, the panic in her eyes hardened into fury. "This is a mistake," she hissed, pushing her chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. "A huge mistake." Lisa watched as she reached into her purse, pulling out a sleek, jewel-encrusted phone. The movement was sharp, precise, a woman used to wielding power, to making calls that could ruin businesses, end careers. But before she could dial, Marcus took a single step closer. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low, almost amused. "Make whatever calls you need to." Victoria hesitated. "You think I built this restaurant, this empire, on the approval of people like you?" Marcus asked, his eyes locked onto hers. "You can threaten all you want, but at the end of the day, people don't come here for you. They come here because of people like Lisa, because of people who work for what they have, who treat others with respect." Victoria's grip on her phone faltered. Marcus straightened, smoothing down the sleeves of his chef's coat. "So, if you'd like to take your business elsewhere," he said, nodding toward the door, "feel free." A ripple of silence stretched through the room once more. But this time, it was different. Lisa saw the shift, not just in the restaurant, but in Victoria herself. The realization that she had lost, that for once in her life, her name, her money, her power, none of it mattered. For a long, agonizing moment, Victoria stood there. And then, without another word, she turned sharply on her heel and stalked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Her friends hesitated, unsure whether to follow immediately or pretend they hadn't been part of this at all. Eventually, one by one, they hurried after her, their heads lowered, their once arrogant posture deflated. Lisa exhaled slowly. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. A second later, applause broke the silence. It started at a table near the bar, one man clapping slowly, deliberately, then another, until suddenly, the entire restaurant was applauding. Lisa blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked around. The older gentleman who had been watching earlier nodded at her approvingly. A woman at a nearby table raised her glass. Lisa turned toward Marcus, who was watching her with quiet pride. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. Marcus smiled. "Of course I did." And just like that, the tension was gone. The restaurant resumed its usual hum, conversations returning, laughter trickling back into the air, the clinking of glasses and silverware, replacing the cold silence that had existed just moments before. Lisa felt something warm settle in her chest. For the first time since stepping into Le Bernard's, she felt like she belonged. Victoria's heels clicked against the marble floor as she stormed toward the exit, her back stiff, her hands clenched around the handle of her designer purse. The weight of the room followed her. Every gaze, every whisper, every quiet smirk of those who had witnessed her downfall. She had arrived in this restaurant expecting reverence, expecting to be treated like royalty. Instead, she was walking out in disgrace. Just as she reached the entrance, she paused. For a second, Lisa thought she might turn around, try to regain control of the situation with one last biting remark. But Victoria didn't. She merely straightened her shoulders and pushed open the grand wooden doors, stepping out into the night like a queen retreating from a battlefield she had lost. And just like that, she was gone. A hush lingered for a few more moments. Then, slowly, the restaurant came back to life. The clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, the quiet strains of classical music. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving only the fresh, crisp air of relief in its wake. Lisa stood there, still holding the napkin in her hands, her heart pounding. Then she heard it, a single clap. It came from a table near the bar, an older gentleman, his silver hair neatly combed, his tailored suit impeccable. He nodded in approval, his hands meeting again in another slow, deliberate clap. Then, a woman at the adjacent table joined in. A few more seconds, and the applause spread. Lisa felt her breath hitch as the entire restaurant erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or exaggerated, but it was meaningful. A few guests even stood, raising their glasses toward Marcus in silent respect, before turning their gaze to Lisa. Some nodded, some smiled, and in that moment, she realized. This was not just for Marcus. This was for her. Lisa's fingers tightened slightly around the napkin as she tried to process it all. Marcus, standing beside her, placed a firm yet gentle hand on her shoulder. "You handled yourself well," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Lisa exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I almost lost it," she admitted quietly. "But you didn't," Marcus said. His voice was steady, unwavering. "That's what matters." A waiter passed by, offering Marcus a respectful nod, before leaning in slightly. "Sir, would you like me to remove Table 7's bill from the system?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "Send it to her estate. Something tells me she won't be back to contest it." Lisa let out a soft laugh. Genuine this time. The tension that had coiled in her chest for the last hour slowly unwound. As Marcus turned to head back into the kitchen, Lisa hesitated, then called after him. "Dad." Marcus stopped. It wasn't the first time she had said it, but something about saying it here, in this place, felt different. It felt right. He turned back to her, his expression softening. Lisa met his gaze, standing taller than she had all night. "Thank you." Marcus gave her a small, knowing nod before disappearing behind the swinging doors of the kitchen. Lisa turned back to the restaurant, where the guests had returned to their meals, their conversations resuming. But something had changed. When she moved through the tables, she wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was seen. And for the first time, Lisa knew. She didn't just belong in this restaurant. She had earned her place. The energy in Le Bernard's had shifted. The tension that had once gripped the restaurant had dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. Guests returned to their meals, their conversations carrying a newfound ease. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered in the air, undeniable and irreversible. Lisa took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had endured humiliation, held her ground, and witnessed justice unfold, not through anger or retaliation, but through dignity. And now, as she moved through the dining room, she could feel the subtle changes around her. A woman at a nearby table, who had remained silent during Victoria's tirade, now met Lisa's gaze with a small, apologetic smile. Another guest, an older man sipping his wine, gave her an approving nod. Even some of her fellow waitstaff, who had hesitated to step in earlier, now looked at her with a new kind of respect. The lesson had been learned, not just by Victoria, but by everyone in that room. At the bar, a businessman in a navy blue suit called her over. "Miss," he said, his voice warm, respectful, "I'd love for you to take my table's order, if you don't mind." It was such a small thing, so simple, but in that moment, it felt like everything. Lisa nodded. "Of course, sir." She moved with a confidence she hadn't felt before, her back straight, her steps sure. At the hostess stand, two waiters whispered quietly. One of them, the same one who had looked away earlier when Victoria had humiliated Lisa, finally spoke. "I should have said something," he admitted, guilt evident in his voice. The hostess, who had also remained silent, nodded. "Yeah, me too." They both watched Lisa as she carried on, serving guests with the same quiet strength she had shown all along. "She didn't need us to," the hostess finally said. "She handled it." And she had. Lisa had come into this restaurant as just another waitress, but tonight she had proven she was so much more than that. The night moved on, but the moment lingered. Lisa stood by the bar for a brief second, watching as the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the murmured conversations. It was all the same, yet somehow, everything felt different. She had spent years believing that silence was the safest option, that people like Victoria always won, that the world wouldn't change, no matter how much she wanted it to. But tonight had proven something else entirely. Respect wasn't just given, it was earned. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Marcus, watching the room with a quiet, knowing look. He didn't say anything at first, just handed her a fresh notepad for taking orders. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Lisa took it with a soft smile. No words were needed, because tonight, for the first time in her life, she didn't need validation. She had stood her ground. She had kept her dignity. And that was more powerful than any insult Victoria Kensington could ever throw at her. As she turned to head toward her next table, she caught sight of a couple at the far end of the restaurant, whispering to each other while glancing in her direction. They weren't the only ones. Somewhere, someone in that room would go home tonight thinking differently, about respect, about kindness, about the weight of their words, and maybe that was the real victory. So what do you think? Have you ever witnessed a moment like this, where someone stood up for what was right, even when no one else would? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the moments we least expect.